Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to explore the fight for women's suffrage in the U.S., specifically the period after the Civil War.
Mhm.
We're using this awesome episode of the American History Tellers podcast.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, it's got some pretty surprising tactics and turning points you might not expect.
Yeah, you're right. It is surprising. And it's, important to remember that while we often associate women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment in 1920, the struggle actually went on for decades before that. We're talking intense legal battles, clever strategies, even some unexpected alliances, all playing out well before that final victory.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with one of those unexpected legal strategies. It was called the New Departure, and it was spearheaded by a suffragist named Virginia Minor from Missouri. This was right after the Civil War. And Minor argued pretty boldly that the 14th Amendment, which was meant to grant citizenship rights to formerly enslaved men, also applied to women and already gave them the right to vote.
It was a really ingenious interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Suffragists focused on those clauses guaranteeing equal protection under the law and the privileges and immunities of citizenship. And they argued that denying women the vote violated those fundamental rights.
Oh, okay.
Of course, there are counter-arguments, mostly around the traditional understanding of women's role in society and the belief that voting was outside that sphere. But Minor's strategy, though it didn't ultimately succeed in the courts, did something really important. It forced the issue of women's suffrage into the national spotlight, and it sparked a wave of women attempting to register and vote, leading to tons of legal challenges.
So using the very tools meant to expand rights for black men to advocate for women's suffrage. That's pretty clever.
Yeah.
And speaking of bold moves, this era also saw the rise of Victoria Woodhull, an absolutely fascinating and controversial figure. She was not only a successful businesswoman on Wall Street, but she was also a vocal advocate for what was then called free love, basically challenging traditional marriage norms. And get this, in 1872, she became the first woman to ever run for president of the United States.
Woodhull was definitely a lightning rod. Her advocacy for free love, for example, really shocked mainstream society. Some people saw her as a visionary for women's rights and social reform, but others saw her as too radical, And her personal life gave a lot of ammunition to her critics. This created a real dilemma for the suffrage movement. On the one hand, Woodhull brought much-needed attention and energy to the cause, but on the other, her outspokenness on controversial topics alienated some potential supporters. And it made it harder to present a unified front that would appeal to a wider audience.
It sounds like it was a constant balancing act for the movement, trying to gain mainstream acceptance while pushing for radical change at the same time.
Yeah, it was.
But while Woodhull brought attention through her unconventional methods, there were others like Susan B. Anthony who were focused on more legal strategies. In 1872, Anthony was arrested for the crime of voting. And she, being Susan B. Anthony, used her trial as this powerful platform to argue for women's suffrage.
Anthony's trial was like a masterclass in using adversity to advance a cause. Instead of just defending herself or pleading for leniency, Anthony turned the tables and put the whole system on trial. Her courtroom speech was electrifying. She very eloquently argued that denying women the vote was a violation of their natural rights and a betrayal of the principles of American democracy. And to amplify her message even further, she went on a whirlwind speaking tour before her trial, traveling across the country and drumming up support for women's suffrage.
Wow.
Her defiant actions and powerful words turned her into a national icon for the movement.
I can only imagine how captivating that speech must have been, hearing her so passionately make the case for women's suffrage. But as we know, legal battles are only one part of the story. When those avenues hit roadblocks, suffragists had to get creative. And one of the tactics they used was tax resistance. For those who might not know, tax resistance is basically refusing to pay taxes as a form of protest. And we see this play out in a really interesting way with the Smith sisters. They refused to pay property taxes because they were denied the right to vote. And in response, the government actually auctioned off their cows.
The Smith sisters' story and others like it highlight the incredible commitment of these women. They were willing to face real consequences, financial hardship, public ridicule, even legal action, all for their beliefs. And their actions were deeply symbolic, you know. By refusing to pay taxes, they were like directly challenging the government's authority and drawing a parallel to the American colonists who had used tax resistance as a tool in their fight for independence. It's a powerful example of how the suffragists were intentionally invoking revolutionary imagery to legitimize their cause and connect their struggle to the nation's founding ideals.
And that connection to the American Revolution was made even more explicit with the New England Women's Tea Party in 1873. It was a direct echo of the Boston Tea Party, with women gathering to publicly destroy tea in protest of taxation without representation. And speaking of dramatic gestures, Susan B. Anthony, never one to miss an opportunity, crashed the centennial celebration of the Declaration of Independence in 1876 and presented the Declaration of Rights of the Women of the United States. Talk about knowing how to make an entrance.
These public displays of defiance were carefully calculated to capture attention and sway public opinion, and they did just that. By drawing parallels to the American Revolution, suffragists were like framing their struggle not as a radical departure from tradition, but as a continuation of the nation's ongoing quest for liberty and equality. These actions, along with the legal battles and strategic alliances, laid the groundwork for the movement's eventual success. But the path to suffrage was far from smooth.
Right. There were definitely setbacks along the way, and some of those came from unexpected sources. But before we delve into that, let's take a quick look at how the movement started to shift its focus and strategies in response to these challenges.
Yeah, okay. One of the biggest setbacks, and maybe the most surprising, came from the liquor industry. They saw women's suffrage as like a direct threat to their business, and they really fought back.
That is surprising. I never would have thought about that. Why were they so opposed?
Well, the temperance movement, which wanted to prohibit alcohol, was gaining a lot of traction at the time. And many suffragists were also active in that cause. The liquor industry was afraid that if women got the vote, they would vote for prohibition, which would shut them down, basically.
So they were worried about losing profits if women got more political power.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But what did that opposition actually look like? Did it have a real impact?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Think back to the Colorado referendum in 1877. Suffragists had really high hopes for Colorado.
Right.
But the referendum was defeated, and a lot of people blamed the liquor industry's campaigns. You know, they had a lot of money, and they spread fears about prohibition hurting the economy. And they painted women's suffrage as like a threat to personal liberty.
It's amazing how a powerful industry like that could really sway public opinion and affect the outcome of these votes. Did this kind of thing happen anywhere else?
Oh, definitely. In Nebraska in 1882, there was another referendum on women's suffrage, but this time the liquor lobby actually resorted to election fraud. They printed illegal ballots that conveniently left out the suffrage question.
Wow. They weren't messing around. That's a pretty blatant attempt to manipulate the outcome of an election.
Yeah.
Did those tactics work?
Sadly, yeah, they often did. And even when suffragists tried to distance themselves from the temperance movement, the liquor industry stayed suspicious, and they continued to actively campaign against them. Take Oregon in 1884, for example. Abigail Scott Dinaway, a leading suffragist in Oregon, she publicly criticized prohibition. She was hoping to like ease concerns and appeal to more voters.
So she was trying to show that supporting women's suffrage didn't automatically mean supporting prohibition. Did it work?
Unfortunately, no. The liquor industry wasn't buying it, and they poured money into defeating the Oregon referendum. They even boozed in men from neighboring Washington territory to vote against it. It really shows you how determined they were to keep women from gaining political power.
That's incredibly frustrating. All that work, and then these outside forces just come in and sabotage their efforts. And to think, in Washington territory, women had actually won the right to vote in 1883, only to have it taken away a few years later.
Exactly. The Territorial Supreme Court reversed the law because of a lawsuit backed by, you guessed it, liquor interests. It must have been so demoralizing to see their hard-won victories rolled back like that. But it's important to note that even with all this opposition, many suffragists, particularly on the East Coast, still thought a federal amendment was like the best way to get voting rights for women across the country.
So despite these setbacks at the state and territorial level, the push for a national amendment was still going strong. Who were some of the key figures leading that effort?
Susan B. Anthony, of course, was at the forefront. Of course. She knew that a federal amendment would be the fastest and most comprehensive way to achieve nationwide suffrage. It was a long shot at the time, for sure, but she never gave up. And in 1878, a pro-suffrage senator from California introduced a constitutional amendment that would prohibit disenfranchisement based on sex. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, another prominent suffragist, even testified before Congress in support of the amendment.
So they were really trying to use their influence and make their case directly to lawmakers. But given all the opposition, I can't imagine it was easy. What happened?
You're right, it was a tough fight, and the Senate voted against the amendment in 1887. But even with this loss, Anthony stayed optimistic.
Really? Why was she so optimistic after a loss like that?
Well, she pointed out that they had gotten 1/3 of the Senate votes, which to her was a sign of progress. She believed they were slowly changing public opinion and that national suffrage was just a matter of time.
It takes a certain kind of resilience to see a loss like that and still have hope. And it sounds like she was right to see the bigger picture. Because even though they had these setbacks at the national level, the movement was gaining ground in other ways.
Exactly. While they were still fighting for federal amendment, the suffrage movement was also expanding and evolving in other parts of the country. We see new organizations popping up, new leaders coming forward, and new tactics being used.
So the movement was becoming more diverse and decentralized. Where did this happen most prominently?
One of the most interesting things is the rise of the suffrage movement in the American West. Now, this might seem kind of counterintuitive because we often think of the West as, very traditional and maybe resistant to social change.
That's true. Why was the West more receptive to the idea of women's suffrage than other parts of the country?
There are a few reasons. For one, a lot of Western territories and states had a more egalitarian spirit because of the frontier experience. Women often had a more active role in society, working alongside men and contributing to the community in ways that everyone could see. And this, in turn, led to a greater appreciation for women's capabilities and a willingness to think about giving them political rights. Plus, many Western territories and states saw suffrage as a way to attract more women settlers, which would boost their population and economies.
So it's a combination of changing social norms and practical reasons. This makes the story of women's suffrage in the West really interesting. Where should we start?
Let's begin with Colorado. In 1893, Colorado became the second state in the U.S. to give women full voting rights, and their success really had a ripple effect throughout the region.
It's a huge victory. What were some of the key factors that led to their success?
Well, the suffrage movement in Colorado was really smart about their approach. They focused on building broad coalitions appealing to both men and women and highlighting the practical benefits of women's suffrage. They argued that women's votes would improve education, clean up politics, and strengthen families.
So they tailored their message to fit with the concerns and values of the people in Colorado. Did this approach differ from what they were doing in the East?
Yeah, in some ways it did. The suffrage movement in the East tended to focus more on natural rights arguments and appeals to, equality. While those arguments were still there in the West, they often took a backseat to more practical and locally focused appeals.
That's fascinating. It shows how the movement adapted its strategies to different situations. And speaking of adaptations, we can't talk about the suffrage movement in the West without discussing the relationship between the suffrage and temperance movements. That's a really interesting one.
Yeah, it is. It's really complex. In some ways, that alliance with the temperance movement was really good for suffragists, especially out west.
Oh, how so?
Well, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, was a powerful and well-organized group back then. They had chapters all over and a ton of members, a lot of them women. Their support gave suffragists valuable resources, networks, volunteers.
So the WCTU gave them like a big boost in terms of people power and getting organized.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But wasn't the temperance movement kind of controversial too? I mean, weren't they trying to ban alcohol completely?
Yeah, and that's where it got tricky. Trying to ban alcohol completely, well, that appealed to some folks, but it really turned off others who thought it was like taking away their freedom, So it was a tough spot for suffragists. They needed the WCTU's help, but they didn't want to lose potential allies who didn't agree with the whole no alcohol thing.
Yeah, I can see that would be hard to balance.
Yeah.
Did the WCTU support suffrage just because a lot of its members were women who wanted the right to vote? Or was there more to it?
It was a bit of both. A lot of WCTU members were definitely suffragists who thought the vote was key to reaching their goals. But the organization also had a more strategic reason for supporting women's suffrage. They believed that if women could vote, they would vote for prohibition, which would be a major victory for their cause.
So they saw it as a way to uh, achieve their own goals.
Yeah.
Interesting how these different groups, each with their own thing they were fighting for, could find common ground. Did any particular battles emerge from the WCTU that were especially influential in the suffrage movement?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Frances Willard, the president of the WCTU, she was really powerful and charismatic. She became a big advocate for women's suffrage. But she had a specific angle. You know, she framed suffrage as home protection, saying women needed the vote to protect their homes and families from all the bad stuff that came with alcohol.
That's a smart way to frame it, appealing to traditional values and women's roles as, caretakers. Did that message work?
Yeah, it did, especially with women who might have been on the fence about suffrage based on just equality. By tying suffrage to protecting the home and family, Willard made the movement appeal to a wider group and got more supporters.
Sounds like she was a savvy strategist. She knew how to connect with people on an emotional level. But even with these, strategic alliances, the movement still had a lot of complexity inside, right? We've mostly talked about white women, but black women were also fighting for suffrage. And they often faced discrimination even within the movement.
That's a really important point. The suffrage movement wasn't like this one big unified group. And black women especially had to fight to be heard and have their experiences recognized. They were fighting on like two fronts, for their rights as women and as black Americans.
Can you talk about some black women who were really important in the suffrage movement and the challenges they had to overcome?
Absolutely. Ida B. Wells Burnett, a journalist and activist who, fought against lynching and racial injustice. She was also a strong supporter of women's suffrage. But she wouldn't be silenced or pushed aside within the movement. Like during a suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., they told her to march at the back with the other black women.
Oh, wow.
Wells Barnett refused, and she waited until her delegation from Illinois came by and then joined them, defying the attempt to segregate.
That's such a powerful example of her standing up for what's right. She wasn't going to let anyone treat her like a second-class citizen, even in a movement that was, supposed to be fighting for equality.
Right. Her actions show that for black women, the fight for the vote was totally connected to the fight for racial justice. They understood that true equality meant getting rid of all forms of oppression, not just the ones that affected them directly.
And their contributions to the movement were really significant, weren't they?
Absolutely. But Mary Church Terrell, for instance, was one of the people who started the NAACP. And she fought tirelessly for, both racial and gender equality. She understood that progress on one front was connected to progress on the other. She challenged both sexism and racism within the suffrage movement and beyond, pushing for a more inclusive approach to social justice.
So as we think about this era, it's so important to recognize all the different voices within the movement and the unique challenges black suffragists faced. It reminds us that the fight for equality was and still is so multifaceted.
That's such an important point. The suffrage movement, it's often presented as one single story, but it was really a mix of different experiences, different perspectives, and different goals.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the fight for women's suffrage in the U.S. after the Civil War. It's been a really interesting journey, exploring the legal battles, all the bold personalities, the strategies they used, and the complexities within the movement itself.
It really has, and
Yeah.
I think it reminds us that progress is rarely straightforward. It's messy, it's complicated, and it often means dealing with internal tensions and competing priorities.
Absolutely. The fight for women's suffrage did eventually succeed, but it took decades of struggle, setbacks, and figuring out what worked. And even after the 19th Amendment was passed, the fight for equal rights wasn't over.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
The legacy of the suffrage movement keeps inspiring us to challenge injustice and push for a more just and fair society. So I hope you'll think about this. What lessons from the suffrage movement really stick with you, and how can you, use those lessons to tackle the challenges we face today?